On April 25, 2026, Iran's president stepped in front of state television cameras and ordered his citizens to turn off the lights. He was not speaking metaphorically. He instructed a population of nearly 90 million to use 2 lamps instead of 10. Government offices immediately downshifted to half-day schedules. The Tehran metro severed its heating systems. Across the sprawling urban grids of Isfahan and Tabriz, municipal street lighting was abruptly slashed by half. According to market panic metrics tracked by the Financial Times, this was the exact moment the geopolitical calculus fractured. What the world witnessed on that broadcast was not a head of state managing a temporary grid failure. It was a president reading a eulogy for his own regime. For decades, Tehran cultivated a mythological narrative that no outside force could ever break their fortress economy. Today, that supreme strategic weapon is being systematically dismantled, not by a campaign of shock and awe, but by a silent, suffocating economic siege. The geography of the Persian Gulf has always been a weapon. At its narrowest choke point, the Strait of Hormuz spans just 34 kilometers, a fragile maritime artery that historically pumped 20% of the world's seaborne oil supply. Iran built its entire foreign policy apparatus around a singular, apocalyptic threat. Cross us, and we close the strait. It was the ultimate asymmetric deterrent, cheap to deploy, catastrophically expensive for the global economy. On February 28, 2026, following coordinated strikes by the United States and Israel, Tehran finally pulled the trigger. They laid sea mines in the passage, boarded merchant vessels, and collapsed shipping traffic by over 70% in a matter of days. They expected capitulation. Instead, they triggered a meticulously engineered trap. On April 13th, the United States imposed a draconian naval blockade on all Iranian ports. This executed a dual blockade scenario. Iran choked off the global energy supply through Hormuz, while the U.S. Navy simultaneously choked off Iran's ability to export a single drop of crude through any alternate route. The results were instantaneous and terminal. If you want to understand the brutal mechanics of how empires rise and collapse in real time, subscribe to this channel right now. We document the geopolitical tectonic shifts that mainstream media entirely misses. Hit the bell, join the briefing. Before the blockade, Iranian crude loadings averaged 2.1 million barrels per day. Within 2 weeks, that volume evaporated to a staggering 567,000 barrels per day. Between April 14th and April 23rd, merely 5 export cargoes were recorded leaving Iranian terminals. This total operational paralysis was achieved through overwhelming technological supremacy. Tehran's underwater deterrence relied heavily on sea mines, a threat designed to create psychological terror and paralyze commercial transit in narrow shipping lanes. It failed. Forward-deployed U.S. mine countermeasures squadrons utilized advanced variable depth sonar systems to map and neutralize the subsea battle space with surgical precision. The asymmetric advantage was obliterated by acoustic physics. On the surface, the evasion tactics of the past decade were rendered completely obsolete. During previous sanctions regimes, Iranian shadow fleets simply disabled their automatic identification system transponders and vanished into the open ocean. That era is dead. According to unclassified assessments from naval intelligence, disabling a transponder against the modern architecture of the U.S. military is a futile, highly visible anomaly. The Navy layered Sentinel-2 satellite imagery over AWACS aerial surveillance and real-time electronic intelligence from Central Command. Every hull was tracked. Every voyage history was meticulously documented. When commercial vessels attempted to run the blockade, the response was kinetic and unapologetic. Central Command forced the redirection of 39 vessels. 3 ships, including the MT Tafani and MT Majestic X, were seized outright and dragged into U.S. custody. The Comoros-flagged MV Blue Star III found itself intercepted in the Gulf of Oman by operators from the 31st Marine Expeditionary Unit, fast roping directly onto the deck from rotary wing assets to execute a hostile boarding. The vessel was only released after a microscopic search confirmed it was not bound for an Iranian port. A total maritime quarantine was achieved. Iran's vessels are geographically caged, but a trapped ship is merely a symptom. The true nightmare for the regime is what happens to the oil that cannot leave the shore. The unyielding reality of global energy markets is that crude oil extraction is an unforgiving mechanical process. It is a system dictated not by political rhetoric, revolutionary fervor, or diplomatic maneuvering, but by fluid dynamics, subterranean pressures, and structural engineering. When the United States Navy sealed the maritime exits, the millions of barrels of crude oil pumping incessantly from Iran's aging subterranean reservoirs had to go somewhere. That oil was forcefully diverted into the vast, sprawling steel storage complexes at Kharg Island, the vital, centralized export terminal responsible for handling a staggering 90% of the nation's crude shipments. The mathematical accumulation was terrifying in its speed. From April 13th to April 21st alone, Iranian inventories exploded, swelling by more than 6 million barrels in a mere 8 days. By April 20th, the massive storage arrays at Kharg Island were sitting at approximately 74% capacity. In the highly volatile petroleum industry, maximum operational capacity is never 100%. Due to the extreme dangers of vapor pressure accumulation, temperature expansions, and baseline operational safety margins, petroleum engineers strictly avoid pushing storage facilities past the 80% threshold. Cross that precise line, and you invite catastrophic structural failure and massive industrial accidents. The countdown clock had not just started, it was deafening. Advanced supply chain models and structural assessments, validated by Chatham House, mapped a brutally short runway, estimating that Iran would exhaust all usable, safe storage capacity within 12 to 22 days under the crushing pressure of a full-intensity maritime blockade. This was not a theoretical vulnerability. It was a mathematical certainty echoed by U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, who observed the crisis with the cold, calculating detachment of an executioner holding a royal flush. Taking to social media on April 22nd, he publicly detailed the exact physical limits of the Iranian infrastructure, warning that Kharg Island storage would be full in a matter of days. He calculated that the sheer physical limit of these storage tanks would inevitably force the regime to choke off its own oil production, triggering an immediate, devastating financial hemorrhage of approximately $170 million in lost revenue every single day. But the immediate, paralyzing evaporation of daily cash flow is merely a secondary trauma compared to the architectural destruction occurring beneath the Earth's crust. Iran is operating a heavily sanctioned, deeply antiquated energy infrastructure. Its mature oil fields are incredibly fragile, heavily reliant on continuous, uninterrupted pressure maintenance to keep crude flowing to the surface. When you aggressively throttle or completely shut in a mature well, the subterranean pressure dynamics completely collapse. Analysts estimate this forces a permanent, irreversible production loss of between 300,000 and 500,000 barrels per day. Sand, water, and debris infiltrate the porous rock formations, permanently degrading the reservoir's integrity. Restarting these fragile wells is not a matter of simply flipping a switch when the political winds eventually change. In petroleum engineering, recovery from this level of shock becomes structurally impossible. A blockade that holds its grip for this duration does not simply damage the Iranian economy. It surgically amputates a massive baseline of its future economic capacity forever. Tehran's elite operators understood this physics problem intimately, which is why they spent billions constructing an elaborate escape hatch designed to render any Western blockade mathematically irrelevant. They believed they had built an unbreakable bridge to the east. But as the storage tanks at Kharg Island groaned under the mounting pressure, Iran looked toward its designated salvation, only to find that its closest strategic partners were already systematically dismantling the exits. The port of Chabahar, situated deliberately on the shores of the Gulf of Oman, was engineered over decades to be the Islamic Republic's ultimate geopolitical insurance policy. Tehran marketed this deep-water sanctuary to the globe as their strategic trump card, an export hub immune to any disruption because it sat entirely outside the lethal choke point of the Strait of Hormuz. It was bankrolled heavily by Indian investment capital and thoroughly integrated into the international north-south transport corridor, backed by both Beijing and Moscow. It was supposed to be the indestructible bridge to Asian energy markets. Today, it is a maritime graveyard. More than 20 massive tankers and cargo vessels are currently paralyzed in the waters off Chabahar, transformed into a multi-billion-dollar parking lot. At least 6 fully laden Iranian oil tankers are loitering aimlessly just inside the perimeter of the American blockade line, heavy with crude, heavily monitored, and completely unable to move. The fatal flaw in Tehran's strategic calculus was the arrogant assumption that the U.S. Navy would stop its operations at the strait. Central Command simply extended the absolute architecture of the naval blockade directly into the Gulf of Oman, suffocating the exact waters through which Chabahar's exports required transit. The reaction from the international community was ruthlessly pragmatic. India, a primary architect and financial backer of the Chabahar expansion, looked at the U.S. naval deployments, ran the cold risk assessment, quietly shelved its Iranian investments, and immediately signed a new logistics contract with the United Arab Emirates Fujairah terminal. Iran's bridge to Asia was abandoned overnight by its own partners, but the absolute tectonic realignment of global energy power was delivered on April 28, 2026. The United Arab Emirates, the third largest producer in the OPEC cartel and a foundational member for nearly 6 decades, detonated a diplomatic nuclear weapon. They announced their unilateral and immediate withdrawal from OPEC and the broader OPEC Plus alliance. The timing of this departure was a masterclass in opportunistic statecraft. By executing this exit during a historic energy shock, Abu Dhabi expertly calculated that the Hormuz closure would mask the immediate market volatility, positioning the UAE for a post-conflict environment where it demands absolute freedom of action to maximize output without the restrictive shackles of cartel quotas. The underlying motive for this defection, however, was written in blood and shrapnel. Throughout the escalating conflict, the UAE absorbed the absolute brunt of Iranian aggression. Tehran's ballistic missiles and suicide drones systematically pounded Emirati energy infrastructure, striking the massive Habshan gas complex and the critical Fujairah oil terminal. For Abu Dhabi, remaining in an organization that required daily coordination with the regime actively bombing its sovereign territory was no longer politically or morally tenable. This is where the financial warfare transitions from severe to unsurvivable for Tehran. By severing ties with OPEC, the UAE unlocked its capability to flood the global market, officially targeting an astronomical production capacity of 5 million barrels per day by 2027. Crucially, this Emirati crude possesses a secure, undisputed route to market that renders the Strait of Hormuz entirely irrelevant. The Habshan-Fujairah pipeline, a 380-kilometer steel artery capable of pumping up to 1.8 million barrels per day directly to the Gulf of Oman, has seen its export volumes surge by 57%. According to the latest geopolitical risk matrix anchored by the Financial Times, this bypass infrastructure has neutralized Iran's primary leverage. Historically, Iran's shadow economy survived sanctions because elevated global oil prices maximize the revenue of illicit barrels. A high price per barrel was the final buffer keeping the regime solvent. The UAE's aggressive production surge is designed to aggressively depress those global prices. Iran is now staring down a two-front economic annihilation, a total collapse in their export volume, paired with a collapse in the per-barrel value of whatever oil remains. Tehran's external leverage has been completely neutralized by hostile neighbors and American warships. But outside the walls of the regime's palaces, the quiet hum of this geopolitical chessboard is being drowned out by the deafening roar of domestic panic. The external blockade has done its job perfectly. The true detonation is about to happen from within. Let us now breach the walls of Tehran itself, Because the most terrifying data point in this entire geopolitical crisis is not what is happening at sea, but what is bleeding out from the regime's own deeply classified intelligence apparatus. On or around April 27, 2026, Iran's Supreme National Security Council, chaired by Secretary Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, convened an emergency session. The internal assessments presented during this briefing were completely devoid of contingency plans, strategic alternatives, or optimistic projections. Instead, intelligence directors delivered a highly critical, mathematically terminal autopsy of the Iranian state. For a government that constructed its entire revolutionary identity on the bedrock concept of a self-sustaining fortress economy, the language utilized in this chamber was nothing short of institutional surrender. According to institutional collapse models, dynamics heavily validated by Chatham House analysts tracking the fallout, the Security Council concluded that the state could withstand the current blockade architecture for an absolute maximum of 6 to 8 weeks. Beyond that incredibly narrow horizon, the economic pain becomes domestically uncontrollable. The internal metrics of this asphyxiation are staggering. Security directors briefed that by the end of the spring season, approximately 2 million jobs could be systematically wiped out across the private sector. The regime's desperate draconian 60-day internet shutdown had already annihilated the income of roughly 20% of the workforce heavily dependent on digital infrastructure. Heavy industry was effectively flatlining. Crucial industrial units across the petrochemical and steel sectors were shuttered, and official steel exports were halted entirely, with recovery from kinetic strikes projected to take years. Furthermore, the domestic banking sector, stock exchanges, and currency markets were effectively paralyzed, freezing the very lifeblood of national commerce. But this macroeconomic collapse is merely the accelerant. The true explosive payload is the baseline misery of the Iranian population. Even before the war commenced, the World Bank projected deep economic contraction, with the national currency having already halved in value. Food price inflation was detonating past 70%. Now, stack a total maritime blockade on top of that baseline despair. Add the permanent loss of oil revenues, the mass industrial unemployment, and the terrifying reality of pharmaceutical prices surging nearly 60% as vital imported medicines become completely inaccessible. Add the lengthening, desperate lines for bread, meat, and milk in urban centers, where the municipal grids can no longer even keep the streetlights burning. Faced with this compounding catastrophe, the security agencies drew one final devastating conclusion. They warned the Supreme Council that renewed nationwide protests were not merely possible and not simply likely. They put down in official writing that violent unrest is inevitable. The only remaining uncertainty was the precise day the streets would ignite. Intelligence officials explicitly highlighted International Workers' Day on May 1st as an immediate flashpoint, warning that an uprising occurring simultaneously with the crushing external pressure of the U.S. blockade could pose a real, terminal threat to the survival of the Islamic Republic itself. Let the gravity of that assessment sink in. The highest security organ of the Iranian state is openly using the phrase survival of the Islamic Republic in its internal damage assessments. The 47-year mythology of the unbreakable resistance economy was not defeated by a sudden invasion. It is being methodically broken by the cold, unforgiving mathematics of supply chains and storage capacity. The story of the Persian Gulf in the spring of 2026 is the story of an asymmetric bluff that was finally called. For decades, Iran held the global economy hostage, operating on the foundational assumption that the world needed access to the Strait of Hormuz more than it needed to defeat Tehran. That foundational premise has officially collapsed. The Iranian strategy demanded a paralyzed, terrified international community. Instead, it met a world that had quietly, methodically built the steel pipelines, the satellite tracking networks, and the maritime infrastructure required to survive without them. Iran threatened to deny oil revenues, and the United States Navy built a waterproof blockade. Iran threatened regional hegemony, and the United Arab Emirates defected from OPEC to unilaterally flood the market. When the bypass pipelines are running at full capacity and U.S. Marines are boarding ships at will, the Hormuz card holds absolutely zero strategic value. The chessboard has fundamentally shifted. Every move the regime makes now carries irreversible consequences. The diplomatic runway has narrowed to a sliver. Where this crisis goes next will definitively rewrite the architecture of Middle Eastern power for a generation. The countdown at Kharg Island is ticking, and the streets of Tehran are waiting. Do you think the regime will find a way to the table and capitulate before the economic pressure triggers total state collapse? Or are they betting they can somehow outlast the inevitable firestorm? Tell me your strategic assessment in the comments below.